They found Dimitri Volkovich dead in his penthouse with a single bullet through his chest, and nobody could agree on who had fired it. His empire was dismantled, his bank accounts were seized, his wives had scattered in different directions, each one claiming betrayal by the others, each one insisting that she had been the victim while everyone else had been complicit. But the destruction had happened long before his death. It had happened slowly, methodically, through years of conflict and manipulation, and the gradual realization that the women imprisoned inside his mansion couldn't trust anyone, not even each other. On the surface, Dimitri was a mafia boss with 11 wives, which made no sense, but beneath that surface was a secret that would tear those women apart from the inside, forcing them to choose between their own survival and each other's safety. This is the story of how grief becomes weaponized, how a man's guilt destroys not just him, but everyone trapped inside his attempt to contain it.
Before we continue, please like and subscribe for more interesting stories. All stories and images are purely AI generated.
Dimitri married Valentine when he was 28. Valentine became pregnant, a son, Michael. At 4 years old, Michael was kidnapped by Dimitri's enemies. The ransom was paid. The body was never found. Michael was simply gone, erased by the violent world his father inhabited. Dimitri descended into obsession. He needed to understand why. He needed to know if his bloodline was cursed. He needed to confirm that his choices had destroyed his son. So he began having children with other women, deliberately, intentionally, testing his genetic legacy across multiple bloodlines. Francisca had a son named Peter. The boy grew up in isolation, carefully protected, sequestered from Dimitri's criminal world. But distance couldn't save him. At 18, Peter was kidnapped, tortured for information about Dimitri's operations, and returned psychologically destroyed. Peter attempted suicide twice before succeeding on his third try at 21. Francisca watched her son deteriorate and understood with absolute clarity that Dimitri had destroyed him. Dimitri fathered children with 9 other women. Some died, some were severely damaged by violence related to his criminal conflicts. Some carried trauma so severe that they couldn't function in normal society. And when he could no longer deny what was happening, when he could no longer pretend that his genetics or his distance or his protective measures could save his children, Dimitri made a decision that would imprison 11 women. He married all of them. Kimberly was the first wife to suspect something was deeply wrong. She married Dimitri for power, not because she had borne his child. She was intelligent enough to notice patterns. She noticed that certain wives seemed to be suffering from a specific type of grief. She noticed that Dimitri visited young men and women who bore his facial features. She began investigating carefully, documenting everything. She found hospital records, death certificates, evidence of children who had died or disappeared. Kimberly confronted Dimitri in his office. She demanded to know what was happening. Dimitri, exhausted by the weight of maintaining his secret, told her a partial truth. He told her that he had fathered children with multiple women. He told her that some of those children had died. He told her that he had married certain mothers to keep them close, to monitor them, to ensure they didn't speak publicly about their dead children or about his role in their deaths. Kimberly made a calculation. She could expose Dimitri and destroy him, or she could use this information to gain leverage over him. She chose leverage. She began blackmailing him subtly, demanding more money, more control, more authority within his organization. She positioned herself as the wife who knew the secret, which gave her power over the other wives who didn't know.
Kimberly understood that in a system built on secrets, information was the only real currency.
Valentine had been trapped for 17 years. She had lost Michael. She had been forced into a second marriage to the same man who had created and then lost her first son. Valentine became cold. She became calculating. She began secretly contacting federal prosecutors, dropping hints about Dimitri's vulnerabilities, building a case that could be used against him eventually. But Valentine wasn't trying to save the other wives. She was trying to save herself. She was preparing for a future where Dimitri was destroyed and she was the only one left alive to testify. She viewed the other wives not as allies, but as competition. She viewed their suffering as leverage. She began telling Kimberly's secrets to other wives, sowing discord, ensuring that no unified alliance could form against Dimitri. When Kimberly discovered that Valentine had been undermining her position, she retaliated. She told Dimitri that Valentine had been contacting federal authorities. Dimitri increased Valentine's isolation. He restricted her movements. He monitored her communications more carefully. Valentine realized that she had lost a crucial advantage, and she began searching for new allies. Julie married Dimitri, believing she could save him. She was a nurse, trained to heal broken people, drawn to his vulnerability and pain. She spent nights listening to him describe his dead children. She believed that her love could cure his obsession. She believed that she could help him process his grief and move forward. But slowly, Julie began to understand the true nature of the system. She realized that Dimitri wasn't seeking healing, he was seeking punishment. He wanted to suffer, and he wanted witnesses to his suffering. Julie became sick with guilt. She had been comforting a man who was essentially torturing the mothers of his dead children by forcing them into marriages designed to contain his guilt. Julie tried to help the other wives escape. She began collecting information about security protocols. She began planning routes out of the mansion. She told Patricia that they could work together to break free. Patricia initially agreed. They began stealing money. They began documenting abuse. They made plans to disappear together. But Patricia became frightened. She realized that attempting to escape might result in Dimitri hunting them down. She realized that there was nowhere safe to go. She decided that survival meant compliance. So Patricia went to Dimitri and told him about Julie's escape plans. She gave him dates and times and detailed information about what Julie had been doing. Patricia was betraying Julie to ensure her own safety. It was a calculation, not a choice, but the betrayal was absolute. When Dimitri discovered Julie's escape attempt, he didn't punish her violently. He simply increased her isolation. He made her movements more restricted. He ensured that no opportunity for escape would present itself again. Julie realized that Patricia had betrayed her, and the two women became bitter enemies. Julie began spreading rumors about Patricia's infidelity. Patricia responded by documenting every moment of Julie's emotional instability. The two women who had been allies became each other's greatest threats. Jacqueline married Dimitri and descended into psychological collapse. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. She became convinced that the mansion was a prison designed to drive her insane. She tried to escape multiple times. Each time, Dimitri brought her back. Each time, he told her that she couldn't leave because he needed her, that abandoning him would make her responsible for his suicide. Jacqueline was desperate. She began manipulating the other wives, telling each one different stories designed to drive wedges between them. She told Kimberly that Valentine was secretly working with federal authorities. She told Patricia that Julie was planning to expose everyone. She told Julie that Francisca had been having secret meetings with prosecutors. She created a web of suspicion and paranoia that made unified action impossible. For a while, it worked. The wives became so focused on distrusting each other that they stopped thinking about escaping together. But Jacqueline made a crucial mistake.
She told Francisca that Kimberly was planning to leave the mansion and take most of Dimitri's assets with her. Francisca, who had been quietly planning her own rebellion for years, realized that Jacqueline was actively destabilizing the group. Francisca began the slow process of recruitment. She approached Patricia and suggested that they work together to expose Dimitri. Patricia, terrified after her betrayal of Julie, refused. Francisca approached Julie and suggested that they work together. Julie wanted to believe that an alliance was possible, but she had been betrayed before. She was too afraid to trust. Francisca approached Kimberly and suggested that they could use their combined knowledge to bring down Dimitri's entire empire. Kimberly listened carefully. Kimberly saw the potential in an alliance with Francisca, who had information that Kimberly didn't possess. But Kimberly also saw the risk. If the alliance failed, she would be exposed as a conspirator. If the alliance succeeded, Francisca would claim credit and potentially expose Kimberly's complicity in the system. So Kimberly did something calculated. She told Dimitri about Francisca's attempts to recruit allies. She told him that Francisca was trying to organize a rebellion. She offered to help him manage Francisca's isolation and prevent her from spreading dissent. In exchange, Kimberly asked for increased authority and control over the other wives' movements.
Dimitri agreed. Francisca found herself increasingly isolated. The other wives, warned by Kimberly that Francisca was dangerous, began rejecting her. Francisca was trapped in a mansion filled with women who saw her as a threat. She had been outmaneuvered by Kimberly, who had sacrificed potential allies in exchange for greater personal power. But Francisca was patient. She began drinking heavily, allowing herself to appear unstable. She stopped speaking to the other wives. She stopped attempting to recruit allies. She appeared to give up. And while the other wives relaxed their vigilance, Francisca was quietly documenting everything. She was recording conversations. She was collecting evidence. She was preparing for something that nobody could predict. Valentine, watching all of this conflict unfold, made a decision. She began playing both sides. She told Kimberly that Francisca was becoming increasingly unhinged and should be watched carefully. She told Francisca that Kimberly had revealed her plans to Dimitri. She told Patricia that Julie was still trying to escape and would inevitably be caught. She told Julie that Patricia had betrayed her. She amplified conflicts. She deepened divisions. She made herself useful to everyone by being perfectly willing to betray anyone. Valentine wasn't trying to help anyone. She was trying to ensure that the wives remained fragmented, unable to form a unified front, incapable of taking collective action. Because Valentine understood something that the other wives didn't understand yet. She understood that Dimitri's system would eventually collapse, that federal authorities were closing in, that the empire was dying. And when it died, the wives who had the most information and the least complicity would survive best. So Valentine was quietly positioning herself as the wife who was least connected to everyone else, the wife who had been blackmailing Dimitri, the wife who had been contacting federal authorities, the wife who could credibly claim that she had been a victim of the system rather than a participant in it. Desmond was Dimitri's oldest friend, the only person who had stuck by him unconditionally. Desmond watched the wives tear each other apart. He watched Kimberly manipulate them. He watched Valentine play both sides. He watched Francisca quietly plan rebellion. He watched Julie and Patricia betray each other. He watched Jacqueline try to destabilize everyone through lies. Desmond was dying. Cancer was consuming his body. He had months left, maybe weeks. He was tired of maintaining the secret. He was tired of watching women destroy each other while protecting Dimitri's obsession with his own guilt. Desmond decided to tell the truth. But he didn't tell everyone. He told Kimberly first, because Kimberly was already closest to the truth. He told her about Michael and Valentine's lost son. He told her about Peter and Francisca's broken child. He told her about the 7 other children that Dimitri had fathered with the other wives. He told her about the system that had been built to contain Dimitri's guilt by imprisoning the mothers of his dead children.
Kimberly's investigation had been correct, but she had been missing the complete picture. Now she had it. She understood that the entire system, all 11 marriages, all the manipulation, all the control, was designed for one purpose: to keep the mothers of Dimitri's dead children close enough to suffer alongside him. Kimberly made a decision. She contacted the other wives, but she didn't contact them all at once. She contacted them individually. She told them each a slightly different version of the truth. She told Patricia that Julie had known the secret all along and had been complicit in the system. She told Julie that Patricia had been working with Dimitri to keep the wives divided. She told Francisca that Kimberly wanted to help her expose Dimitri. She told Valentine that Desmond had revealed something that could be used against her in court. Kimberly was amplifying the information, but she was twisting it. She was using the revelation about the dead children as a weapon to further divide the wives. She was using the truth to consolidate her own power and position. The truth spread through the mansion like acid, burning through every relationship. Julie felt sick. She had been comforting a man who was using his dead children as tools to control women. She realized that her entire marriage had been built on a lie. But she also realized that the other wives might blame her for not exposing the system sooner. She began covering her tracks. She began destroying evidence of her complicity. Patricia felt betrayed and terrified. She had betrayed Julie to survive, and now she realized that her survival was built on sand. She had sacrificed another woman's freedom to protect her own, and that sacrifice might not even keep her safe. Patricia began panicking. She began considering going to federal authorities herself, trying to negotiate a deal before the others could. Francisca felt rage, pure crystalline rage. Her son's death had been used, his memory had been weaponized, his suffering had been cataloged and studied as part of Dimitri's obsession. Francisca's rage became focused, it became purposeful. She stopped drinking, she stopped appearing unstable, she began planning with methodical precision. Jacqueline, broken and isolated, simply disappeared into her own mind. She stopped eating, she stopped speaking, she existed in a state of complete psychological disconnection. Valentine watched all of this unfold and made another calculation. She increased her contact with federal prosecutors. She offered them more information. She told them that the wives were destabilizing, that someone might become violent, that the situation inside the mansion was deteriorating rapidly. She positioned herself as the wife most willing to cooperate, most eager to testify, most desperate to be extracted from the situation. The wives stopped trusting each other completely. They stopped eating meals that other wives prepared because they began to suspect poisoning. They stopped speaking to each other because they suspected that every conversation was being reported to Dimitri or to federal authorities. They transformed the mansion into a war zone where each woman was fighting for her own survival against all the others.
Kimberly tried to maintain her leverage by threatening to expose the others' complicity. Francisca responded by threatening to expose Kimberly's blackmail scheme. Patricia tried to negotiate with Dimitri, offering to remain silent in exchange for financial security. Julie began recording everything, documenting abuse, preparing to use the evidence against everyone if necessary. The alliances that had briefly formed shattered. The temporary agreements fell apart. The wives became enemies, not because they hated each other, but because trust had become impossible. Desmond died before the final collapse. He died knowing that he had set in motion a chain reaction that would destroy everything. He died hoping that the wives would eventually find some kind of healing, though he knew that hope was probably futile. He died having finally kept a secret from Dimitri, the secret that he loved the wives more than he loved the man he had served for 40 years. Federal authorities descended on the mansion on a Tuesday morning. They had warrants, they had testimony, they had documentation from Valentine, who had been cooperating for months. They arrested Dimitri. They released the wives. The system collapsed. But the collapse wasn't clean. The wives didn't emerge healed or whole. They emerged fractured, each one blaming the others for her suffering. Julie blamed Patricia for the betrayal. Patricia blamed Julie for forcing her into a position where betrayal was necessary. Jacqueline blamed Kimberly for using her manipulation to gain power. Kimberly blamed Francisca for threatening to expose her. Francisca blamed Valentine for undermining every attempt at unified action. Valentine blamed everyone for being too weak to see what she had seen. Each wife was escorted out of the mansion separately. Each one was questioned separately. Each one was offered a deal separately. And none of them knew, in those early hours of freedom, what the others were telling authorities. None of them knew if their confessions were being corroborated or contradicted. None of them knew if survival meant loyalty to each other or betrayal of each other. They made their choices based on fear. Desmond was arrested and charged with multiple counts of coercion, false imprisonment, and conspiracy. But before the trial could begin, before the case could be built, one of the wives came forward with a request. She wanted access to Dimitri's private office. She wanted to look for something specific. She wanted to find his personal journals. Federal authorities granted the request. They had already seized his documents, but they allowed one of the wives to review them. What she found inside those journals destroyed something that had already been broken. Dimitri had documented everything. He had recorded his observations of each wife. He had written detailed notes about their grief, their isolation, their fear. He had cataloged their suffering like a scientist studying laboratory specimens. He had written about which wives were breaking fastest, which ones were most likely to attempt escape, which ones were most vulnerable to manipulation. But there was something worse, something far more devastating than simple documentation. There were letters that Dimitri had written to each wife but had never sent, letters where he confessed his true feelings, letters where he revealed his knowledge that the system would eventually collapse, letters where he admitted that he didn't expect the wives to stay silent forever,
that he didn't believe his marriages could contain his guilt permanently. And in one of those unsent letters, Dimitri had written something that reframed everything. He had written that he had married the 11 women not to protect them from his guilt. He had married them because he believed that they deserved to suffer. That if his bloodline produced tragedy, then the women who carried his children deserved to experience that tragedy. That the only way to balance the cosmic injustice of his children's deaths was to ensure that the mothers suffered as profoundly as he suffered. That his guilt needed witnesses, needed to be shared, needed to be distributed among the women who had borne his children. He had married them not as a system of protection, but as a system of punishment. The wife who read this letter didn't identify herself. She simply returned the journals to federal authorities. But the knowledge of what she had read spread quickly. One by one, the other wives discovered the truth about Dimitri's intentions. They understood that they hadn't been imprisoned to be protected from consequences. They had been imprisoned to be punished for bearing his children. They had been forced to suffer because Dimitri believed that their suffering was justice, that their grief was deserved, that their captivity was not a system of control, but a system of retribution. The guilt that the wives carried shifted. It had been one thing to be imprisoned by a man consumed by his own guilt. It was something else entirely to realize that they had been imprisoned by a man who believed that they deserved to be imprisoned, that they had been victimized not incidentally but intentionally, that Dimitri had constructed his system with full knowledge of what it would do to them and had done it anyway because he believed they should suffer.
The trial was brief.
Dimitri was convicted. He was sentenced to 25 years. He would likely die in prison. His empire was dismantled, his money was seized, his properties were confiscated. His name became synonymous with corruption and cruelty. But the trial didn't end the suffering. It didn't resolve the conflict between the wives. It didn't heal what had been broken. Julie spent years in therapy trying to understand her complicity in the system. She had enabled Dimitri by loving him. She had enabled him by believing that she could help him. She had enabled him by staying silent when she suspected the truth. The guilt consumed her more effectively than any prison could have. Patricia disappeared into a quiet life, never speaking about what had happened. She carried the knowledge of her betrayal of Julie silently. She carried the weight of choosing her own survival over another woman's freedom. She never forgave herself. Jacqueline was hospitalized for psychiatric treatment for 2 years before slowly rebuilding something resembling a normal existence. She had destabilized the group through manipulation, and that manipulation had contributed to the very suffering she had been trying to prevent. The irony of her situation was inescapable. Francisca channeled her rage into victim advocacy. She spent the rest of her life speaking about exploitation and betrayal. She became a voice for women trapped in systems of control. But she never forgave herself for not acting sooner. She never forgave herself for choosing survival over helping the others escape. Kimberly faced legal charges for her own role in the system, for blackmailing Dimitri, for manipulating the other wives, for using information as leverage. She was convicted of conspiracy and served 5 years. When she was released, she was a different woman. The ambition that had driven her was gone. She had learned, too late, that power built on the suffering of others destroys you from the inside. Valentine survived better than the others. She had positioned herself perfectly. She had offered testimony. She had claimed victim status. She had been extracted from the situation with her freedom and most of her assets intact. But survival at the expense of everyone else left its own scars. She never trusted another person again. She never allowed herself to be vulnerable. She constructed a life of perfect isolation that looked like success, but felt like prison. Jacqueline, Patricia, Julie, and the other wives who had been less strategic in their betrayals spent years processing the knowledge that they had destroyed each other, that they had allowed Dimitri to turn them into weapons against themselves, that in trying to survive, they had ensured that nobody would survive whole.
In prison, Dimitri died of a heart attack in his cell. Nobody attended his funeral. Nobody mourned him. He was buried in an unmarked grave in a prison cemetery, alone, forgotten, his name already becoming irrelevant. But his legacy lived on in the wives who had survived him. His guilt had metastasized into their guilt. His obsession had become their obsession. His system of control had transformed into a system of self-destruction that continued long after his death. The 11 wives had been imprisoned together in the same mansion, sharing the same grief, inhabiting the same nightmare. But they had never truly been allies. They had never been able to support each other. They had been forced to compete for Dimitri's attention, for resources, for survival. And in that competition, they had discovered something far more devastating than physical imprisonment. They had discovered that the worst prison is the one you construct around yourself. The worst captivity is the one enforced by other victims. The worst destruction is the one that happens when people trapped together choose betrayal over solidarity. Dimitri's true genius wasn't in creating a system of control. It was in creating a system where the victims would control each other, where fear and desperation would force them to betray each other, where the only way to survive was to ensure that someone else didn't.
And the wives, slowly, over years and decades, had to come to terms with the knowledge that they had participated in their own destruction, that they had been complicit in each other's suffering, that freedom had come not from unity, but from the final, complete abandonment of trust. In the aftermath, the wives existed separately, each one alone with her own version of the story, each one unable to speak to the others without confronting her own betrayals, each one carrying the knowledge that she had survived by choosing herself over her sisters, each one understanding too late that survival purchased at that price was just another form of imprisonment.